All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today for session 4 of our How to Secure Your Data webinar series. We're going to go ahead and get started. I always have a pet peeve of when webinars start 7 minutes after the start time. So we got a good group joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm Dan Finn. I'm our Synergy Technicals Director of Strategic Accounts, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. So today's subject, like I said, is part 4 of our How to Secure Your Data webinar series we've been running. And today's topic is web protection services and app proxies. Adrian's excited about this topic for us today, so glad you could join us. This session is being recorded within the Teams live event. So if you do come off mic to ask questions or drop in a question and answer, I'll relay those verbally back to Adrian at the end and get them addressed, and I'll open up that Q&A box once Adrian gets going here. So a little bit about us, Synergy Technical, we are a technology consulting firm headquartered out of Richmond, Virginia, with offices up and down the East Coast. We've got clients in all 50 states and 70 plus countries, and we manage over 2 million licenses of Microsoft 365 for our end users. We excel at securing a productive workforce in complex environments, and proudly we were the recipient of Microsoft's 365 Security Deployment Partner of the Year award just in February of 2020. So an award we're super proud of, and has sort of led to this webinar series. So a large part of that success was Adrian Amos traveling the nation and doing security workshops for our end users and turning those into assessments and pilots around the EMS suite, or what Microsoft calls their Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite of technology. So Adrian is going to be our speaker today. He's had the honor of running his security workshops at Microsoft Ignite the past 2 years. At one point, 15 different security sessions within a 4-day span, I believe it was, which is just mind-boggling, excuse me. But it's always exciting to hear from Adrian. He speaks with customers across industries and really understands the security challenges that y'all are facing. So with that, I'll introduce Adrian. And Adrian, if you want to go ahead and share your presentation, it should take over mine. And I will open up the Q&A box. If anyone has questions throughout the remainder of the session, just feel free to drop them in there and I'll make sure they get addressed at the end.
Yeah, sure. So you can actually go ahead and leave the slide up for just a second. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the background about why we're talking about and what we're talking about today. Or you can take it down. I don't care either way. So yes, I am actually truly more excited than usual today. And that is because we have reached not just the end of our 4-part series on data protection, but also the culmination of a multi-part series that have come together to talk about how we're tying together a whole bunch of different security signals and a whole bunch of different controls to deliver a true end-to-end secure experience, not just covering devices, not just covering apps, not just covering data, but identity as well. And actually, just as a teaser, in a few weeks, we're going to circle back to identity and cover some really crazy mind-bending stuff that's happening in the identity space. But the real main reason why today is so near and dear to my heart is because I actually get to go put on my 90s hat again and go way back to 1999 when I got my very first Microsoft security or Microsoft certification. And that was in Microsoft Proxy Server 2.0. And wow, what a trip back down memory lane, because I went after that one because it was the easiest one in the Microsoft portfolio at the time, but I didn't really realize how important that certification was going to be to framing my next 20 plus years of doing this work. Way back in the day, Microsoft produced proxy server technologies, and we all just sort of ran with it and used it to protect our outbound communications to the internet. But I actually had a conversation a couple of years ago with a Microsoft engineer when I said, hey, why has this whole space just been abandoned? And they said, well, you know, we actually only really produced proxy server technologies to protect IIS. And because in the old days when we had IIS 2, 3, 4, and 5, the security capabilities of that product were deficient. They just were. And you know, you used to be able to go and have a great time playing on the internet, finding unprotected IIS servers and just taking them down, right? That was just kind of everybody's favorite fun thing to do. It was easy to find people that had unprotected IIS servers because IIS loved to advertise that it was IIS published out there on the internet. So between that and the real need for organizations to have users connect back to Exchange services from outside the network over, laptops connected to the internet with OA and whatnot, those really were the actual technology drivers that pushed Microsoft to produce proxy services. And what I did not know for a long time was, after we went from proxy server to ISA server, and we saw that go through like 3 or 4 major iterations, they just completely got out of the market in 2010 with the release of Exchange Server 2010. Microsoft officially took the line at that point that their actual server technologies were secure enough that they no longer needed to be protected by some object sitting in a DMZ running this as a proxy engine. What a lot of people feel like they failed to take into consideration with that major fundamental shift in logic was that most organizations really actually weren't using proxy services for that purpose. Most of us had Active Directory integration to our proxy servers to give our users secure access out to the internet. They kind of put us out of business with that model for a very, very long time. And when asked about it, most of the time they would just say, yeah, no, we don't really view that as a real concern. Most workloads are in the cloud, and if you want to go get a proxy server, there's plenty of other vendors out there. I mean, literally, I actually had Microsoft people tell me there's plenty of other vendors out there, which seems crazy, right? So I was actually kind of a little bit taken aback a few years ago when Microsoft first kind of dipped a toe back into the idea of proxying, when they reintroduced the idea of reverse proxying with what they called at the time web app proxies. And we're going to get into that today, but it took a very, very long time between that initial consideration of the web app proxy and a training class that I got to sit in October of 2017, when Microsoft for the very first time in 7 years mentioned the idea of proxying access to external applications. And man, did my ears pick up. I got really excited. And now here we are in the second half of 2020, and there are actually 3 different things in the Microsoft 365 stack that we can refer to as proxying. And we're going to go through all 3 of those things today. A couple of them we're going to be able to actually do as demos, and one of them, unfortunately, I don't have any server infrastructure to protect, so you're just going to have to trust me that it works, and we can look at some documentation. But we're going to start our journey with what Microsoft originally envisioned the idea of proxying to mean. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's see, I'm going to share my whole desktop. I'm going to be brave today. Dan, I'll go ahead and make you small. You might pop up from time to time. All right, anyway. So I am in my Contoso tenant. I have a few different things going on over here. Actually, I'm in the wrong browser, but no big deal because we can fix that. In our Azure Active Directory space, we have the ability now to create proxy access into our on-premises applications. And there may be a few good reasons why we need to do this. We may have a significant investment in a web-based application that's written on a server that has back-end ties to some other stuff on-prem. We've looked at it, we've decided it just doesn't make a lot of sense for us to rehome this into Azure. But I'll be daggone if I really want to be spending a lot of time configuring VPN access for all of my users to come back into the network and then still work with this, on-premises application. Obviously in the COVID times now we're seeing like massive amounts of additional taxes on our VPN solutions. That's getting more expensive and all that fun stuff's happening. Anyway, Microsoft has actually had pre-addressed this a long time ago. Like I said, about 2015 or 2016, we first got this idea of a reverse proxy access for on-premises applications. So if I go over to my enterprise applications, and this is not just for app proxying, by the way, this is the gateway to doing our SSO integrations to all of these thousands and thousands and thousands of other SaaS applications that exist out there. But I can come out here and I can see what all the applications are that my organization has corporate ties to, that I've enabled either a federation to this application, or I've bundled some sort of a single sign-on approach, or maybe even I have identity provisioning in it. But we're going to come here to enterprise applications to create an application access from the cloud with no VPN infrastructure to get back into our on-premises years-old web app that just isn't suitable for cloud migration. So if I click on new application, I have the options to do a or I can choose from the gallery. I can see there's thousands of things here in the gallery that I can just bolt my identity into. I can do a non-gallery application where I have to tell it what all the URLs are and do all this fancy work, or I can hit on-premises application. And what's going to happen here is the first thing I'm going to have to do is on-prem, I'm going to need to download an application proxy connector. And I'm going to put that on site in an on-premises server. And ideally, it's going to be near the server itself, right? And that server is then going to communicate outbound only to my Azure environment. And whenever anybody tries to click on the new published URL or the new published icon for that application, it's actually going to use service bus technology to see, hey, is there a pending request for this? And because this proxy connector is sitting on premises, it's going to have access to not just the web app, but the Active Directory that's handling the authentication. Now, what gets really cool about this is that a lot of times, part of the reason why we may not be able to migrate this app to the cloud is that maybe it just doesn't have the security capabilities that we really need to put an application like this out into the wild. But by doing this, by having this connection between the on-premises connection, by forcing it to only be outbound communication to Azure Active Directory and only published to the right users with a link that they have embedded in their little homepage, we're going to actually be able to layer in pre-authentication using Azure Active Directory. And that means that if we go back over the last 8 weeks of all the stuff that we've talked about with conditional access and app protections and all that kind of fun stuff, we can start building conditional access policies to make sure that only the right people even have that button in the first place, that only the right people on the right devices, once they click on it, can be authenticated into it, and that only that set of conditions will then activate a call or a service bus request for that application to then get delivered to that remote user. And I won't go too super deep into it. And you know, for the second time in a couple of weeks here, I'm actually going to click on a Microsoft documentation link, because this actually it gives a pretty good little simple visual of how this works, right? So we're going to set up this proxy connector on premises. Like I said, it's going to have visibility into our Active Directory. It's going to have visibility to the web server. And then this proxy application proxy service is just going to publish an icon. And it's going to show up in their little portal.office.com as an application that they have available to them. Super duper simple for the users. And the great thing is, when we're going through this, we can actually tailor the URLs to match what they see inside if our namespaces support that. So that we don't even need to retrain our users on how to get back into that application. But that is the traditional approach of what a proxy server was designed to be from Microsoft. And we can see that we can actually do this now in the cloud. I'd have to check on, and Dan and I can go and check and figure out what the licensing requirement is for this today, but I believe it's simply Azure Active Directory P1 grants you the rights to do this to, I think, I'm not sure how many. It's 10, I think, at a minimum, but it may be unlimited with a premium license. Anyway, that's the original traditional concept of what a proxy was. And Azure AD App Proxy is where we're able to do that today. But that's not how most people used proxies. And that's not how most people want to solve the proxying problem, right? Most people that we talk to have really wanted to know how to secure the web traffic for their internal users. And I did say there are 3, and there's actually kind of a 4th one that we'll touch on a little bit here. And you've actually already seen me do it in the last several series of this series. But what we need to do is we need to actually bolt on web content filtering. And as of a month or 2 ago, I think it was probably 2 months ago, Microsoft actually started including web content filtering natively in Defender ATP. So about 4 or 5 months ago, they announced a partnership with a third-party company called Cyren, C-Y-R-E-N, that you could buy their product and directly and natively integrate it into Defender ATP, and you could start doing content filtering for your users. And it was going to be super simple and all this fun stuff, but it did require an extra license, and it was a little bit confusing as to how you got it, how you provisioned it. That has all been wiped away. The tool is still there. It is now actually natively integrated into it. And of course, right now, it's not going to load up in my thing because we're live and that's how we work. Oh, yes. All right, here we go. So we can actually come in here now and simply create a new policy, and that general policy is going to have a name. So we'll say name, and then we'll say what are our blocked categories here. We can open this up and we can see there are lots of different categories to choose from. You know, lots of things we can go through and play with here. We're going to just say criminal activity. We'll go to next. And then we can just start choosing how we want to scope this. Now, remember, this is a Defender ATP capability, which means that when I select from my list, my device groups are not Active Directory groups. They're Defender ATP groups, which has a lot to do with how we handle auto remediation. So keep that in mind when you're going through this. You're not picking from AD groups. There's no reason why you can't recreate AD groups, but you're not picking from them as it stands today. So I might choose that I don't want my help desk looking at criminal activity. I come over here and I hit save, and that's it. I have now created a web content filtering rule for just a subset of users to prevent just one type of activity. Now, you can see I've also got a rule here set for no games or gambling, no naked times, pretty normal stuff, right? Most of them are scoped to all, but there's a thing here too. I have an audit only rule, and this is a little bit of a tricky thing. I'm not actually blocking any categories with this rule, and I'm not scoping it down in any way in particular. I've just got audit only as a policy name. It turns out the way this web content filtering is set to work, if you want to audit your devices, you need an open blank rule like this. And what this will do is it will simply assess where your users are trying to go over time. Now that's great. We have these simple rules out here, right? But how do we actually get them to work? Well, it turns out they're working through network protection. Now, that means that we have to pull in another thing in order to configure network protection. And it just so happens that in this case, we're doing that with Intune, right? So I mentioned over this course of this thing, every single configuration I do for all of my devices is always handled through Intune, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create an endpoint protection policy in Intune. And that endpoint protection policy is simply going to say that we're going to enforce network protection. We're going to enable it. Enable it or audit only are really our only two choices. That's working. We're actually deploying it. If you remember, through a policy set, my standard image policy set is the way that we're getting this thing out to all of our users. So I don't need to go back and remember to turn this on for all of my devices and users. And when we come back over here and we say, hey, what are we getting on this thing? It turns out if I come back to Defender ATP and I go to my web protection tab, you're going to see that I pulled out Diego and Grady Archie's computers and I fired them up to just watch some YouTube all day long yesterday. 4-hour streaming music channels. And Alan DeYoung here on my computer right here, he's decided that he's going to take his lunch break today. He's going to play some online poker. Let's see, this looks like a good one. He's going to play some online poker here, and it comes back and it says the content is blocked. Now, Alan's a clever guy. He thinks that maybe he can get around that by coming out here and doing it in Chrome. Now, I will tell you the experience is a little bit different, right? Microsoft's going to play best with Microsoft technologies. But if I come out here and I say play online poker, and let's see, I think, well, let's just go to Poker Stars. Now that's going to come back and actually pull up a toast notification, right? Because Microsoft's not going to be able to control necessarily the specific error messages in Chrome, but we can use web or network protection to enforce a toast notification to come up and tell the user that what they tried to do is strengths verboten. So what that ends up looking like, if I come back out over here, I don't have enough data yet in this space to really pull a category change, activity change over time. And there's been no particular threats seen so far. I haven't tried to go to any malicious hacking sites or anything like that, but I can see categorized web requests and filtering blocks. So if I want to come in here and look on my filtering blocks, I can see that I'm hitting several users trying to do the gambling. Hey, look, there's that siren thing up in the top corner. So you can see that we're still using that technology, but we've just integrated it. So I can see that I've had 14 requests. All 14 have been blocked from 2 devices trying to get to 4 different domains. If I come and look and see what those domains are, I can see that my users are trying to go to these places. I can see what device groups are being impacted by this. And I can do this across the board for all of my different web activity requests, all of my blocking. Now, You notice, remember, I have that audit rule, right? So I'm not blocking YouTube, but I'm really curious about things like high bandwidth utilization. So who in my organization is just coming out here and hammering away at high bandwidth stuff? So you can see I've got 3 requests, no blocks against streaming media and downloads. Looks like, you know, oh, hey, here's my users. It looks like they're all trying to go to YouTube. And it looks like all of them are related policies there. I'm able to get directly to those and see and tailor those policies if I need to make a change. Now that's built into Defender ATP, okay? That's one of the things that all I need for this set of tools to work is Intune to turn on network protection and Defender ATP to do the content filtering. But there are times, and let me back this up. These are categories. And one of the questions that comes back up is, what if I know about a thing and it's not in one of those categories, and I want to make sure that my users aren't getting there, because that would be very poor. Maybe there's a reputation harm to the organization, or maybe I believe that that particular website is just real daggone bad, right? Now they're malicious actors and they keep trying to dupe our users. In that case, I can't actually modify these categories. I can go out to Siren's website and I can see you know, what they're adding to their categories, and they are actively managing those categories. But I can also come down into my indicators, and this is something that I've talked about a lot over the last several months. We have content filtering, but we also have the ability to create custom indicators of compromise. We have these 15,000 slots that we can fill with specific IP addresses, specific domains, specific file hashes, and even certificate chains that we do not ever want to accept in our organization. We don't want these users getting there. And in these cases, what we can do is we can set different rules about how a user is blocked here. So in most of these, actually, these are being generated by Cloud App Security and written into Defender ATP. And we'll get into that in a second. But again, I can say, do I want to block it for all of my users or just some of them or devices? If a user tries to go there, do I want to block and send an alert to our IT guys? Do I want to allow it and basically collect it as an auditable event? Or do I want to, or do I even care, right? Maybe I want to get rid of it. But because Cloud App Security is writing this rule, I actually have some pretty important information about how this works. If I were to come in here and create a URL on my own, I wouldn't have this related software piece right here. So if I were coming into my Cloud App Security to create rules about applications I just don't want my users blocking, it turns out I don't have to know that there's 2 principal domains for this. Cloud App Security knows, and it'll take care of that for me. So let's explore that a little bit, right? So because we've got our content, but we also know that there are certain apps we don't ever want to allow. And we've talked about this in the past. We've looked through our dashboards and we've seen what the applications are that our users are gaining access to. And sometimes they fit nicely in certain content categories and sometimes they really don't. So we really need to be able to get in and make intelligent choices about what our users are using. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, hey, looks like our users are using 14 different apps. If I come down here through the list, I'm going to say, yikes, Yahoo, maybe not the best choice. If I tag that as unsanctioned, that's all I have to do. That is what will create the corresponding rules in this list of indicators of compromise. And again, I can do 15,000 of these specific custom rules. You're probably not going to do that many. But what's important to understand is that that 15,000 is shared across all 4 different spaces here. So whether they're file hashes, IP addresses, URLs, or certificates, you have 15,000 slots for all of that. I don't challenge you to try to fill that up, but I imagine it's unlikely that you will. So I've got my block list here, right? I'm pulling that kind of information from Cloud App Security. That's going to write a rule over to my Defender ATP. If I come back to my list of applications and URLs here, though, and I look at, let's see, let me pull this domain. I'm going to right click on that guy, copy the link, and I'm going to come back into Alan's computer and let's see what happens when Alan, I can't copy paste. Let's just do it. All right. It's going to come up and say it can't be found in Chrome. Yeah, and if I do it in Edge, it should do exactly the same thing that we're seeing here. Okay, there we go. Can't reach the page, can't find the IP address. Simple enough. And actually, in this case, we're getting a slightly different behavior just because of the way that we're actually building this indicator of compromise. So that's how we're protecting outbound connections. But there is still a third principal area of how we're defining proxying nowadays. And that is, we're looking at, and we already kind of touched on it a little bit, we're talking about protecting through conditional access, application access. Sounds a little bit redundant, and it probably is. I'm stumbling over myself, and I apologize. Last in the series, woo! We have the ability, and we've covered this in previous sessions too, to do exciting things like saying, I don't want my users to go home and download content from SharePoint on a personal device, or I don't want them to be able to access certain corporate applications from a corporate device or from a personal device, but it's fine if they do others, right? So in Alan's case, maybe we want to let him go to SharePoint. Okay, and I've done this specific demo a few times before too. So, you know, you're welcome to tune out and have another bite of the sandwich if you've seen this part before. In this case, I have a conditional access policy that says as long as Alan's coming from a corporate device, he can get to SharePoint, no problem. He can do anything he wants to. He can come and preview the media packages. But when he's on his home computer, and again, I'm signed in as Alan DeYoung over here, and I click on SharePoint, I'm going to get an interstitial page. And what you're going to see up here is that that is not .sharepoint.com. That is a Cloud App Security proxy page. And that's going to tell me that my access into this space is monitored. Now, what's important and what we haven't covered in the, maybe we touched on it a little bit last week, what we traditionally haven't covered though is how to actually audit that action or those behaviors. So when I come up here and I look at my users and my apps and all that kind of fun stuff, it isn't super clear as to how to know when somebody's coming in and looking at things that they've done with a personal computer. But it turns out there is actually a Cloud App Security proxy report built into Cloud App Security. And if we look at that report, we can see what are the applications that my users are using from outside the organization from outside devices to get into my organization. And it turns out there's an even simpler way to do it too. So we have that security proxy report, but we also have way down here this conditional access app control report. And it's going to tell us that there have been 82 protected sessions over the last 30 days and 121 protected actions over the last 30 days. So in my case here, I've got 82 times that Alan and Diego and all the guys in Contoso have logged on from a personal device and then tried to get into SharePoint or Teams or something along those lines. And then in many of these instances, once they've gotten in, they've tried to do things that are prohibited by the conditional access policy. So if I scroll down here and look at my 121 protected actions, you're going to see every time that Alan DeYoung has tried to download a file that it has actually been blocked. So we do have auditing in this, and I don't know that I've covered that in the past, but that's an important thing to understand, is we can see that they're actually doing it, which allows us to take proactive actions and say, hey, Alan, I see it seems you're trying to get in from outside. Listen, buddy, we just can't allow that considering what's going on right now. So if I come back over to Alan, and we have another conditional access policy in here too, and that says simply block Yammer on non-compliant devices. Let's see if Alan can get into Yammer. Oops. All right. All right, looks like Alan's getting into Yammer. That's great. He's going to be able to get in here and do all of his yammering and all that kind of fun stuff. But again, I'm at home. I'm on my personal computer. Let's click on the Yammer link that's in here somewhere. Here we go. And it's going to come up and tell me I can't access this right now. So again, this is simply conditional access assessing whether or not I'm coming from a compliant device or one that's joined to Contoso to make decisions about how we're going to allow that access. So let me show you a little bit about how these policies actually work. In many cases, we're going to be taking a single application, applying to a user or group, and we're going to choose a couple of conditions, and then we're going to decide what to do with that. In this case, we're choosing simply whether the device is Azure AD, hybrid Azure AD joined and or compliant, and we're going to then throw it over to conditional access app control. which is a function of Cloud App Security. And in that case, we actually have the ability to create a monitor only, which generates those beautiful audit logs, or block downloads, which is going to put that extra layer on top. We can actually come in and create a custom policy here that's going to have granular controls about what we can do in that space and what we're not going to allow. But what's important to understand is that we can actually do this for any application. So we can publish applications to our Contoso space, give our users access to it and say, yeah, but you can only get into it if you're coming from a compliant device. So it doesn't have to be something necessarily in the Office 365 catalog. Now, if I wanted to use app enforced restrictions, which actually pass control back to the application to determine what to allow and what not to allow, those are restricted to only Office 365 applications. But we can absolutely come in here and say for any application, whether it's an Azure AD app proxy, so we're giving access back to something on premises, we want to allow them in, but we don't want them to download data, which at that point becomes a data extraction out of our on-premises environment. Or if it's a Office 365 or published web app, we don't want to allow them to get in and download data. So maybe we publish a Dropbox link, but we don't want them putting that stuff back on the machine. We only want them to consume it while they're online, or even put things. So kind of getting away from the traditional scary open FTP server thing where anybody who has access can get out there and do a get. We can do all of that here, and then we can protect the entire session by putting things around web content filtering, setting up the alerting, and driving our auditing logs back through Cloud App Security. So we now have enabled all three ideas of proxying, and we can actually protect our users, protect our data, protect our infrastructure, and be secure in understanding that our users are going where they're supposed to go, when they're supposed to go, with the device they're supposed to be using, and from the networks that we trust or don't trust. Wow, that for me is super cool, because that is a conversation I've not been allowed to have for the last 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 or 9 years. Not having to tell people to go back to third-party solutions anymore, and actually knowing we can do all of these things within the Microsoft 365 space is super awesome to me, because again, it takes me back to my very earliest days playing this game. And I'm gonna tell you what, I am so excited that we have finally gotten to this point, and I'm really excited because I have a feeling, based on the way that I'm seeing logs working now and some of the integrations that are happening here, that we're actually going to start to see even tighter integrations between these controls and Cloud App Security. So I'm really excited about what the next 6 months may bring. I'm super jazzed about it, and I hope that if you have questions about proxying, or if there's anything that we can help you figure out deeper in this space, please reach out. I'm always excited to talk about nerdy old proxying and how we can move you past ISA server or even a third-party external proxying control. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for sticking it out all 4 sessions of this one, and the previous 3, and then the previous 2, and all that fun stuff. And I really hope you'll come back and join us when we come back to identity in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, nice job, Adrian. First question, how do you feel now that the series is wrapped up? Now, we did have a question around, and I'm thinking it's in the policies that you mentioned you can create, was it 15,000? But blocking access, you may have shift workers or folks that maybe during their lunch break or scheduled breaks during the day, you want to allow access. Is that where you would configure those policies?
I don't really think you're going to be doing a whole lot of transient policies. I did hear a rumor that time-based controls are being considered in the education space, but I have not heard any confirmation that there's work being done on that front. But in general, I think that the general policy is, and has been in IT environments for years, it's either blocked or it's allowed. There's no in between.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure the question comes from, I guess time-based would be a good, like 12 to 1, you allow, fantasy football.
Yeah, I do know that question has been asked of Microsoft specifically in the education space, because, students take a lunch break.
Between class, yep.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, I appreciate you for putting on 4 different how to secure your data webinars here. I think our customers have gotten a lot of value out of it. Without that, I don't see any additional questions. I do know another webinar series is in the works, so stay tuned